A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
The sound of the sirens over Tel Aviv and Jerusalem has become a sort of grim metronome for life in early 26, hasn't it? We are exactly 2 weeks into this massive escalation that started on February 28th, and I think everyone is feeling that weight. It is one thing to read about interceptors and ballistic trajectories in a textbook, but it is another thing entirely to see the streaks of the Arrow 3 system lighting up the night sky over civilian centers. It feels like the world shifted on its axis the moment those reports of the assassination in Tehran came through, and now we are living in the kinetic aftermath.
It really is the first time in human history we are seeing a sustained, large-scale ballistic exchange involving hypersonic terminal velocities over major cities. My name is Korn, by the way, and I am joined as always by Herman Poppleberry. For anyone joining us for the first time, this is My Weird Prompts, and today's prompt from Daniel is about how to actually process all of this through the lens of media. Daniel is looking for a curated guide to the movies, documentaries, and series that help explain the physics, the strategy, and the human stakes of what we are watching unfold in real time. He wants to know how to build a mental model for a war that looks more like science fiction than the counterinsurgency conflicts of the last 20 years.
It is a timely request because the information density right now is overwhelming. You have the technical side, the IRGC Aerospace Force, the solid fuel motor transition, and then you have the raw human reality of the strikes on places like Beit Shemesh. I think we should try to bridge that gap. We need to look at the media that helps us understand the why and the how behind the headlines. We are moving past the era of proxy wars and into a direct, state-on-state ballistic exchange that the world hasn't really prepared for emotionally or intellectually.
We really do. Most people are stuck in a cycle of doom scrolling through grainy Telegram footage or watching low-resolution TikToks of interceptions. But there is a deeper narrative structure to this conflict that has been building for decades. To understand why Iran is leaning so heavily into this missile-first doctrine, you have to understand the history of asymmetric warfare and the physics of deterrence. This isn't just random violence. It is a highly choreographed, albeit terrifying strategic play. We are calling this our survival guide for the informed observer.
Where do we even start with that? If you had to pick one documentary that sets the stage for the current nuclear and ballistic brinksmanship, what is the top of your list?
I would go straight to the recent Netflix series, Turning Point, The Bomb, and the Cold War. It is comprehensive, but more importantly, it tracks the evolution of the nuclear triad and the concept of global strike capabilities. When you watch that, you start to see that the standoff we are witnessing today between Iran and Israel isn't just a regional spat. It is the latest iteration of a logic that was perfected during the Cold War. The series does a fantastic job of explaining the move from liquid-fueled missiles, which take forever to prep and are vulnerable on the pad, to the solid-fuel monsters we are seeing launch from those hidden underground cities today.
That transition to solid fuel is something we have touched on before, specifically back in episode 918 when we looked at Iran's arsenal. But Turning Point makes it visceral. It shows you the sheer panic of the early missile age. When you see the footage of the old Titan silos, you realize that the IRGC has essentially built a 21st century version of that, but they have done it with the benefit of modern automation and Chinese imported components like sodium perchlorate.
The sodium perchlorate angle is vital, and Turning Point touches on the industrial chemistry of the arms race in a way that makes it click. In the documentary, they talk about the supply chains of the 1950s, but today, that supply chain runs through East Asia and into the Iranian desert. The reason the current conflict feels so high stakes is that these solid fuel motors allow for what military planners call a use it or lose it scenario. If Iran feels their launch sites are being targeted by Israeli F-35 jets, They can launch in a matter of minutes. There is no long fueling process that satellites can pick up on easily. It creates a hair-trigger environment where the window for diplomacy is measured in seconds, not days.
Which leads to the physics of the actual interception. I saw some footage recently of an Arrow 3 kill that looked like it happened literally in the stars. It was a clean, silent flash of light against the blackness of space. It made me think of the technical challenges we often see dramatized in documentaries about the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars as it was called in the 80s.
That is exactly the parallel. Arrow 3 is an exo-atmospheric interceptor, meaning it hits the target while it is still in space, outside the Earth's atmosphere. The physics there are actually quite elegant compared to the chaos of the atmosphere. In space, you don't have to worry about air resistance or the missile burning up from friction. You just have to solve a very high-speed math problem. You are hitting a bullet with another bullet while both are traveling at several kilometers per second. But, as we saw in the March 1st attack on Beit Shemesh, the system isn't perfect. When you have a saturation attack of 50 or 60 missiles, the math gets exponentially harder.
But then you have the Fata 2. That is the one that everyone is worried about right now because of its claimed hypersonic glide capabilities. How does the media we are recommending help us understand that specific threat? Because hypersonic is a word that gets thrown around a lot in the news right now without much explanation.
There is a documentary called Codename Sickle that explores the history of high-speed flight and the early attempts at maneuverable re-entry vehicles. It helps you understand that hypersonic isn't just a buzzword for really fast. It means the missile is traveling at least 5 times the speed of sound, but more importantly, it is changing its path. Most ballistic missiles follow a predictable arc, like a thrown baseball. You know where the ball is going to land the moment it leaves the hand. But a hypersonic glide vehicle like the Fata 2 is more like a paper airplane thrown by a giant. It can swerve, it can skip off the atmosphere, it can change its target mid-flight.
And that swerving is what makes the terminal phase so terrifying. If you are a commander in the Kiryat bunker, you are looking at a radar return that is moving at Mach 10 or 12, and you don't know if it is heading for a military base or a shopping mall until the very last seconds. The reaction time is almost zero. It turns the entire concept of civil defense on its head.
That brings us to another great recommendation for Daniel and the listeners. 1983, The Brink of Apocalypse. It is a documentary about Able Archer 83, which was a NATO exercise that almost triggered a full-scale nuclear war because the Soviets misinterpreted the signals. It is a masterclass in the dangers of deterrence by punishment. In the current 2026 theater, every missile launch is a signal. Iran isn't just trying to destroy targets, they are trying to communicate that they have the capability to overwhelm the layered defense systems. The Brink of Apocalypse shows how easily those signals can be misread when everyone is operating on zero sleep and high adrenaline.
It is a high-stakes game of poker where the cards are Mach 12 missiles. It reminds me of the film 13 Days, which covers the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even though that is a dramatization, the way it portrays the tension in the room, the way every tiny piece of intelligence is weighed and measured, it feels incredibly relevant to the CENTCOM coordinated defense operations we are seeing now. When you see Kevin Costner and Bruce Greenwood debating the quarantine of Cuba, you can almost swap them out for the current Israeli cabinet or the generals at U.S. Central Command, trying to decide whether to strike the launch sites in Isfahan.
13 Days is essential viewing because it focuses on the decision makers. We often talk about the hardware, but the hardware is controlled by people in bunkers who are exhausted, stressed, and working with imperfect information. When you see the footage of the current Israeli cabinet meetings or the IRGC command centers, you have to imagine that same level of brinksmanship, tension. The film highlights the salami-slicing strategy, where one side takes small steps to see how much they can get away with before the other side snaps. We saw that during the 12-day war back in June of 25. It was a series of escalations that felt like they were testing the boundaries. And then, of course, the February 28th assassination of Khamenei changed the game entirely. Now we are in a direct exchange, and the salami slicing has turned into a full-on butcher shop.
We should talk about that transition from a shadow war to a direct conflict. It is perfectly captured in the series Tehran on Apple TV+. It is a spy thriller, but it is deeply grounded in the reality of the Mossad-IRGC rivalry. It shows the technical sophistication of the Iranian cyber defense and the sheer audacity of the Israeli intelligence operations. If you want to understand the human cost and the intelligence war behind the missile launches, that is the show to watch. It makes the abstract concept of asymmetric warfare feel very personal.
I love that show because it doesn't paint either side as a caricature. It shows the IRGC officers as competent, dedicated, and technically skilled. That is something we have to remember. Iran's missile program isn't just a collection of old Soviet parts. It is a domestic, highly advanced aerospace industry. They have built an entire strategic doctrine around the idea that they can't compete with the Israeli Air Force in the sky, so they will dominate the space above the sky. They have turned their geographic disadvantage into a ballistic advantage.
That asymmetric logic is the core of their strategy. We discussed this in episode 964, where we did a clinical audit of their arsenal. They know they can't win a dogfight between an F-35 and a MiG-29, so they invest in 2,000 ballistic missiles. It is a saturation strategy. If you fire 50 missiles at once, even the best defense system in the world might miss 2 or 3. And if those 2 or 3 are carrying high explosive warheads, or worse, that is a strategic victory for them. It is about making the cost of defense higher than the cost of offense.
And speaking of the human cost and the intelligence side, we have to talk about Zero Dark 30 and Munich. These films are often discussed in the context of counterterrorism, but they are actually about the clinical cold reality of state-sponsored targeted killings. Munich is particularly haunting right now. It is about the aftermath of the 1972 Olympics, but the theme is the cycle of vengeance. When you look at the February 28th assassination and the subsequent missile barrages, you see that same cycle playing out on a much larger, much more destructive scale. The film forces you to ask, what is the endgame? If you take out a leader, but the system he built is designed to function without him, have you actually changed the strategic calculus?
It is the Hydra problem. You cut off one head, and the IRGC Aerospace Force just promotes the next general in line. Zero Dark 30 is also relevant because it shows the grind of intelligence. It is not all James Bond action. It is years of analyzing satellite imagery, signal intercepts, and human intelligence. The level of detail that goes into identifying a hidden missile city, like the ones we talked about in episode 993, is staggering. You are looking for a specific type of ventilation shaft in the middle of a mountain range, or a slightly wider than normal road leading into a desert cliffside.
Those hidden cities are a great example of the dual-use technology dilemma. Iran often claims their space program is for peaceful satellite launches. But if you can put a satellite into orbit, you've already solved the hardest parts of building an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. You have the heavy lift rockets, the guidance systems, and the staging technology. Documentaries like The Nuclear Tipping Point explore how this civilian cover is used globally to mask military ambitions. It is a shell game played with rocket engines.
It is a clever shell game. You build the infrastructure for space launch vehicles, or SLVs, and then one day you just swap the satellite for a warhead. The physics is the same. The only difference is the trajectory. Instead of going into a stable orbit, you are coming back down on a target. The documentary, The Nuclear Shell Game, is another one I'd add here. It is specifically about the challenges of verifying nuclear and ballistic agreements. It helps you understand why neutralization is such a difficult goal. Even if you think you have destroyed the production facilities, the knowledge and the smaller modular components are often tucked away in places you would never think to look, like a nondescript warehouse in a Tehran suburb.
And that coming back down part is where the engineering gets truly insane. The thermal stresses on a warhead re-entering the atmosphere at Mach 15 are high enough to turn most materials into plasma. You need advanced carbon-carbon composites and sophisticated heat shields. When we see the debris from intercepted missiles in the Negev desert, we are looking at some of the most advanced material science on the planet. It is a dark use of human genius. Another film that I think provides a lot of strategic logic context is The Americans. I know it is set in the 1980s, but it captures the deep cover and the long game of geopolitical standoffs better than almost anything else. It shows how the Shadow War isn't just about missiles, it is about the quiet theft of technology. The IRGC's ability to produce solid fuel domestically is the result of decades of industrial espionage and technology transfer.
You can draw a direct line from the secrets stolen in the 80s and 90s to the missiles being fired today. It is a reminder that warfare is an all-of-society effort. It is the scientists, the spies, the factory workers, and the truck drivers who move the missiles into those tunnels. It makes the conflict feel much larger than just the 2 weeks of fighting we have seen so far. It is a generational struggle that is finally coming to a head.
And the 12-Day War legacy from last June is really about the realization that no amount of intelligence can fully stop a determined adversary from launching. You can't hit every tunnel. You can't intercept every drone. The future of urban defense, which we are seeing play out right now, is about resilience rather than invulnerability. Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow 3 are incredible, but they are not a magic shield. They are a way to buy time and reduce the scale of the disaster. They turn a catastrophic event into a manageable one, but the trauma remains.
That is a sobering thought. When you watch a film like The Hurt Locker, it is on a much smaller scale, just one explosive ordnance disposal team in Iraq, but it captures that feeling of one mistake and it is over. On a national level, that is the pressure the Israeli defense crews are under. They have to be right every single time. The missile only has to be right once. That asymmetry of pressure is what drives the anxiety we are seeing in the civilian population. Every siren is a reminder that the defense system is being tested to its absolute limit.
It is the nuclear threshold concept we discussed in episode 722. Once a nation has the technical know-how and the raw materials, they are effectively a nuclear power, even if they haven't assembled a bomb yet. They are just a 7-day sprint away from it. Iran has been at that threshold for a long time, and the current conflict is, in many ways, the result of that threshold being crossed. The media literacy we are talking about today is really about learning to see the why behind the what. When you see a video of a missile launch, you shouldn't just see a rocket. You should see the culmination of 40 years of strategic planning, industrial espionage, and a very specific worldview that prioritizes deterrence by punishment.
So, if we were to put together a must-watch list for Daniel to help him navigate the rest of this year's developments, what are the top 3? We need to give him a solid starting point.
First, Turning Point, The Bomb, and the Cold War. It provides the essential historical and technical foundation. You cannot understand 2026 without understanding 1962. Second, Tehran for the human and intelligence side of the IRGC-Mossad rivalry. It puts a face on the people behind the screens. And third, 13 Days to understand the sheer, gut-wrenching tension of the command and control side of a missile crisis. It shows you why leaders make the choices they do when the stakes are literally existential.
That is a solid list. I would also add Munich just as a reminder of the human cost and the long-term consequences of these targeted operations. It is easy to get lost in the coolness of the technology, the Mach 12 speeds and the exo-atmospheric kills, but at the end of the day, these are weapons designed to kill people and destroy cities. We have to maintain that respect for the gravity of the situation. The March 1st attack on Beit Shemesh was a horrific reminder of what happens when the defense system is overwhelmed or when a missile is specifically aimed at a civilian population.
That is an important reality check. We are missile nerds, and we find the physics fascinating, but we have to maintain that perspective. Which leads to the question of propaganda versus capability. When we watch military footage released by the IRGC or the IDF, how should we be filtering that? Because right now, social media is flooded with missile porn that is often highly edited.
You have to look for the unseen. Propaganda always shows the successful launch or the successful intercept. It never shows the dud that fell in the desert or the interceptor that malfunctioned and hit a greenhouse. When you are watching military footage, look for the technical details. Is the flame from the rocket steady? A flickering flame can indicate a problem with the fuel grain. Is the trajectory smooth? Does the kill look like a genuine impact, a kinetic kill, or just a proximity fuse going off. A kinetic kill is much harder to achieve but much more effective against a heavy warhead.
I have noticed that in a lot of the Fata 2 videos, they show the launch, and they show the missile glowing as it re-enters, but they rarely show the impact on a specific target. That suggests they are still struggling with the terminal guidance at those extreme speeds. It is one thing to go Mach 10, it is another thing to go Mach 10 and actually hit a specific building. Heating is the enemy of guidance. If your senses are melting, or if the air around the missile has turned into a sheath of plasma, you are essentially flying blind. That is the physics of the terminal phase that most people miss. The missile is basically a fireball at that point. How do you see through that fireball to find your target? That is the billion-dollar question that the US, China, Russia, and now Iran are all trying to solve.
It is a wild time to be following this. We are essentially watching the next generation of warfare being tested in our backyard. The 12-day war was the opening act, and the 2026 Iran war is the main event. It is terrifying, but from a technical perspective, it is also the most significant shift in military strategy since the introduction of the aircraft carrier. The age of air superiority, being enough, is over. If you can't defend your cities against a mass ballistic strike, your fancy jets don't matter as much. You need that layered, integrated defense. You need the Arrow 3, the David Sling, and the Iron Dome all talking to each other in real time, guided by AI that can process millions of data points per second.
And that is where companies like Modal come in, providing the GPU credits that power the kind of simulations and AI models needed to coordinate these defenses. It is all connected from the server farms in the US to the interceptors over Israel. It is a global technological ecosystem. And for our listeners, the takeaway should be that staying informed is your best defense against the doom-scrolling anxiety. If you understand the mechanics of what is happening, the sirens are still scary, but they are no longer a total mystery. You know what the Arrow 3 is doing. You know why the Fata 2 is a threat. You know the strategic logic behind the launch.
Knowledge is a form of armor. I think we have given Daniel a lot to chew on here. The media we recommended isn't just for entertainment, it is for education. It is about building that mental model of modern warfare so you can see through the noise. We want people to move from being passive consumers of tragedy to being active, informed observers of history.
I hope it helps. This conflict is going to be with us for a while, and the more we can talk about it with technical clarity and historical context, the better off we will all be. It reduces the power of the propaganda on both sides when you can look at a piece of footage and say, okay, I see what is actually happening there.
I agree. We should probably wrap it up there. We have covered a lot of ground, from the physics of re-entry to the shadow war of the Mossad. We have looked at the history of the Cold War and the reality of the 2026 theater.
It has been a deep dive for sure. Thanks for the prompt, Daniel. It really pushed us to look at the meta side of how we consume this war. It is a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about war are just as important as the weapons we use to fight them.
Before we go, a quick thank you to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly during these crazy times. We know it hasn't been easy to keep the lights on and the mics hot while the world is in such a state of flux. And of course, a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We literally couldn't do this without that technical backbone. They are the silent partners in everything we produce.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives helpful, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show, especially now when everyone is looking for reliable, technical information that cuts through the political noise.
You can also find all of our past episodes, including the ones we referenced today, like episode 993 on the hidden missile cities and episode 918 on solid fuel motors at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, along with a curated reading and watching list for this episode. If you want to dive deeper into the physics of the Fata 2 or the history of the Arrow system, that is the place to go.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts. It is a great way to stay in the loop without the algorithm getting in the way of your information flow. We post technical updates and extra context there as well.
Alright, that is it for today. Stay safe out there, stay informed, and we will talk to you in the next one. Remember, the goal isn't just to watch the news, it is to understand the forces that are making the news.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.